If you are completely unfamiliar with fighting games, but wanted to get into them today, you'd be spoilt for choice. Not just because there are a lot of amazing looking games to look forward to, but also due to the sheer variety of what's already out there. Street Fighter continues to represent more traditional fighting games in terms of mechanics, pace, and visuals. Meanwhile, air dashers like Melty Blood and Guilty Gear offer insane movement options and a roster of unique characters with special gimmicks and unique mechanics. Then there's obviously Tekken, as the last bastion of 3D fighting games. Not only that, but we also have some interesting subgenres, such as platform fighters, which is best represented by the Smash Bros. Series, and arena fighters, which offer a more action-oriented spin on the fighting game formula. All this variety is a direct result of the genre's incredibly long history. A more than 50-year-long journey of game developers inventing new things and creating countless iterations to make something fun and original. That's why in this video series, we want to go back to the past and trace the path that fighting games took throughout the years, uncovering the roots and following the many branches of this sprawling genre. I'm your host, Arya from That Blasted Salami. Let's get into this. Two people fighting one another for sport or entertainment has been a part of human history since ancient times. But it took a surprisingly long time for that to turn into a game. The most iconic and perhaps earliest example of this is the Rock'em Sock'em Robots toy that came out in 1948. The toy offered a very minimalist recreation of boxing, where the titular robotic fighters would punch each other until one of their heads popped up. The earliest attempts to adapt fighting and martial arts into a video game were similarly crude and basic, and yet still rather interesting, as nobody had any blueprints or rules to follow. Sega's Heavyweight Champ is usually credited as the first ever title to fit into the fighting game genre. Like the toy we mentioned before, this game represented boxing at its most primitive level. Moving the controller up or down would give you a high or low punch, while moving it towards the opponent would launch a strike. Land hits, get points, win. Fairly simple. In 1987, the game would get a single-player-only remake with slightly more involved gameplay, but similarly unique controls, where you moved around by physically rotating the top part of the cabinet, which had two handles, to produce different kinds of punches. After Heavyweight Champ debuted hand-to-hand combat in video games, Tim Skelly did the same for Armed Combat in Warrior, a 1979 arcade game published by Vectorbeam. Fairly ambitious for its time, the game had you control one of two wireframe knights. With only one joystick and button, you had to switch between moving your character and swinging the sword, which led to some clunky combat. Additionally, the cabinets couldn't render a background, so one had to be printed and then laid on top of the screen. While there was still plenty of room for exploration, games based on real martial arts, and specifically boxing, continued to dominate consoles and arcades. There are two standouts amongst them. One is Nintendo's iconic Punch-Out!, a game that truly gamified boxing by testing the player's pattern recognition and reaction time against a varied roster of charismatic fighters. The other one is Sega's Champion Boxing. Unremarkable on the surface, it's more important due to the fact that it was Yu Suzuki's debut in the gaming industry. The titles we've mentioned have certainly made their impact on the gaming industry and development of fighting games, but the mid to late 80s were the true catalyst for the genre. Karate Champ, released in 1984, deservedly gets mentioned as the game that truly spawned the genre. It was entirely focused on 1v1 fights, and offered a surprising amount of depth for its time. Using two joysticks, the player could move around, jump, crouch, or produce a variety of attacks to beat their opponents. Despite how archaic the game feels and looks by modern standards, you can still see the same sort of appeal that fighting games still have today, with tense fights that require good spacing, reads, and strategy. Karate Champ truly brought the appeal of fighting games to the mass market, and achieved remarkable sales, leading to a wave of copycats like The Way of the Exploding Fist and International Karate. The latter especially was so similar to Karate Champ that Data East even tried to sue Epix, but the court later found no copyright infringement. With that said, some of the games that Karate Champ influenced ended up making their own unique contributions. One of the biggest examples is Konami's Yi Ah Kung Fu, released only 5 months after Karate Champ. Instead of making another game that offers a semi-grounded depiction of a martial arts tournament, Yi Ah Kung Fu cranked things up, and was more reminiscent of classic Hong Kong action movies. The entire game similarly revolved around 1v1 fights, but instead of other generic karate guys, you fought against unique bosses who wielded various weapons or represented different martial arts. Even without the versus mode, it ended up being fairly similar to what would become a standard arcade mode experience in fighting games. Notably, it also switched from the typical one-hit KO or score systems in favor of the now familiar life bars. The connections between fighting games and beat-em-ups would also continue throughout the decade. In November 1984, Irem released Kung Fu Master, which was also heavily inspired by the then popular martial arts movies. The game featured fairly standard gameplay for the genre, but also added unique bosses for every stage. Much like Champion Boxing, this game is largely notable due to the fact that it was made by Takashi Nishiyama, who would go on to create Street Fighter. Interestingly enough, 2 years after Kung Fu Champion, he worked on a rather obscure game called Trojan. It was yet another straightforward beat-em-up, until it was ported to the Nintendo and received not only a bunch of extra content, but also a versus mode, where players could duke it out in a 1-to-3 match, which essentially makes it Capcom's very first fighting game. 3 other beat-em-ups that came later would also feature versus combat. The first 2 are the gruesome Barbarian Ultimate Warrior and the classic Double Dragon, both of which came out in the same year of 1987. While the Versus was just another mode in Barbarian, in Double Dragon it was quite a surprising twist, where if the game was beaten in co-op, players would have to fight one another over the heart of their crush after defeating the final boss. 2 years later, a similar concept appeared in Street Smart, but unlike Double Dragon, the fight between the 2 players was largely optional, and only served to determine who would get a bigger bonus. To cap things off, there's one title that came out in the late 80s and marked a very significant point in the history of fighting games: the original Street Fighter, released in August 1987. Even if you love Street Fighter, chances are you probably haven't heard much about the original game, and that's because it's not very good. Even at the time of release, it wasn't particularly successful at first. Despite having arcade cabinets with big displays and very detailed graphics for the time, it was met with mixed responses due to the unusual controls. You know how there are light, medium, heavy attacks in Street Fighter? That only came with the second revision of the original game. The first iteration instead came with pressure-sensitive buttons, and naturally, people slammed the hell out of those buttons to get the meatiest attacks, tenderizing their hands in the process. Luckily, it didn't take long for Capcom to realize that making people smash the cabinets up wasn't a great idea, so they quickly replaced the pressure-sensitive buttons with the setup that we now know today. It would also influence many fighting games to come, as you've no doubt played at least a few 2D fighters with the classic 6-button setup. Street Fighter also marked the first appearance of special moves that have since become a staple for the genre. Funnily enough, people didn't even know the inputs when the game just came out, so finding the iconic Hadoken, Tatsumaki, and Shoryuken was purely down to luck and experimentation, especially when coupled with the original Street Fighter's finicky input reading. Outside of that, the original game was a big evolution in one-on-one fighting games. The arcade mode allowed you to play against a variety of unique bosses who'd later become playable characters, while Versus mode started out as a mirror match between Ryu and Ken, offering just enough depth and engaging gameplay to make Street Fighter one of the better-selling arcade cabinets at the time, especially after the controller revision. While the original Street Fighter was relatively impressive for its time and a modest success, Nothing could have prepared Capcom or the gaming industry in general for the absolute phenomenon that was Street Fighter II.
Become DashFight supporter on Patreon. Gain ad-free browsing on our site. Click the link in the description.
And that concludes part 1 in the fighting game history series, covering the origins of the genre and its early development. Most of the titles we talked about barely even resemble the fighting games that we're used to today, and yet, so many decades later, we can still spot some clear connections and similarities. In part 2, we'll enter the 90s, which many would call the golden era of fighting games. Not only because it marked a massive uptick in the genre's popularity, but also due to the emergence of many new series and subgenres that we know and love today. Until next time, this has been Arya from TBS, wishing you an excellent day.